Hello everyone! In part 24 of our roguelike tutorial series, we'll be transforming our character select screen from this to this. It's been a while since we've touched on our character select scene, and you can tell just by looking at it that there's a lot to improve. Currently, it just consists of buttons with the character and weapon name. There's no stats, no description, nothing much giving us any info about the characters, and most of all, there's no visuals. It's just a group of white buttons on a blue background and it looks really plain. Hence, we're going to be doing a revamp of the entire character select screen. We'll be referencing the original Vampire Survivors character select, but you can also just take the concepts in this video and customize your select screen as you'd like. We'll first create the UI such as the dynamic scroll view, the stats section, and the description box. And then, we'll create an icon template that works with a script to generate character icons for each character in your project. Without further ado, let's get upgrading. To start off, let's rename our current character screen scene name. It's named the menu right now, but calling it Character Select would be more appropriate. If it tells you to reload the scene, simply click Reload to proceed. Now before we start working on the UI, we'll need to check whether the canvas is set up properly. Let's go over here to the canvas game object and check its canvas scaler component. As you can see here, the UI scale mode is set to constant pixel size, so that means when I resize the window, the UI will stay the same size regardless. Now that isn't good because your UI will not display properly on screens of different sizes, limiting the amount of devices that can play your game. You want the UI to adapt to the screen, so we'll change the scale mode over here from constant pixel size to scale with screen size. We'll change the reference resolution to 1280 by 720 since this is a common 16 by 9 aspect ratio that most displays support. Now, you can see when we resize the window, the UI changes its size to match. After making the canvas adaptive, we can create our first new UI, a separate select character button. Currently, when we enter play mode like right now, and select a character, we are instantly teleported into the game. Since we'll add a stats section and a description box later that the player can read, we'll allow the player to browse through the characters by clicking on their icons, and once they've chosen a character, they can click the select button to get into the game. Let's delete the old character buttons we have over here, and let's create a new UI button text mesh pro game object underneath the canvas. We'll rename this button to Character Select button, and you can use the anchor values that I'll be inputting right now to position it at the bottom right corner. So this one should be 0.02 and then 0.17. Remember to set the left, top, right, and bottom values to position it, and there we go. If you're making your own layout, you can also just use your mouse to reposition and resize the button like so, and then just drag the anchors over here to the corners of this button. Maybe clean the anchors up, and set these values to 0. Now this is much easier than trying to just trial and error through changing the values over here, so this is just a tip. Now let's recolor the button to something like green, and let's change the text so that the player knows that they need to press this button to select a character. Let's just bold it for emphasis and add some more sizing, like that. Once we're done customizing the button, we'll need to go back to the button components game object over here and add a new onClick function. Next, we'll drag in the scene controller in the hierarchy into this field, and for the function, we'll select the scene controller's scene change function. Now over here, this is a really important step. You need to type in the exact name of your game scene because this function will be teleporting the player to it. Our game scene is called game with a capital G, so let's just spell it out over here and press enter. And now we're done with the select button. Our next addition to the character select screen will be the stats UI. Now in part 18, we've already created and prefabbed a stats display over here in prefab's UI, and you can simply just drag this stats prefab into the canvas like so. If you haven't prefabbed the stats display, you can also just go into your game scene and copy it over from the pause menu. It should be under canvas, screens, pause screen. So copy it over, go back into the character select, and right click the canvas. remember to paste it in as a child. And there we go. After that, we'll anchor the display to the top left, and you can use these values as reference. Remember to set the left, top, right, and bottom values to 0 as well. Before we forget, let's also unpack the UIStatDisplay prefab over here by selecting Prefab and then Unpack. This is because it will be customized differently from the one in our game scene. After this, let's create a background for the stats display since it is currently transparent. Right-click the UIStatDisplay game object, select UI, and then Image to create an image game object as a child. Let's rename this image to Frame, and then open up the Anchor Presets menu. Hold Alt down and select the stretch for both horizontal and vertical in the corner over here, and the image should cover up the stats display. Next, for the source image, we'll select the frame, which is in our UI sprite sheet down here. And we'll set the pixel per unit multiplier to something a bit higher like 2 so it doesn't cover up the text. Next, we can go back to our UIStatDisplay's main image, set it to none, and we'll be able to recolor the background as needed. Once you're done customizing your stat display, open up the UIStatDisplay script in Visual Studio. We'll be modifying it to work inside of our character select screen. Over here in the script, we've added a new character data variable called character, allowing the script to handle both player stats and character data. We've also added in a new function called getDisplayedStats, and what this function does is if the player variable is present, which basically means that the stats display is in the game scene, it returns the stat struct of the player's current stats to be displayed. If there is no player present but a character data is instead, this means that the stats display is in the character select screen and returns the stats of that character to display. Now, we can go on to creating the scrolling character selector UI. First, we'll need to create an image underneath the canvas like so. And we'll rename this image to Character Select Background. What this image is both a background and holder of the scroll view we'll be using to hold the character select icons. Next, we'll need to anchor the image like so. And remember to set the left, top, right, and bottom values to 0 as well. Once we're done anchoring it, you can either select a source image to use as the background, or you can just recolor it. After we're done with the character select background, we can add a frame to it. And the frame creation process is basically the same as how we created the frame for the UIStat display. Simply right-click the character select background and create an image as its child. After that, we can rename the image to frame, and then open up the Anchor Presets menu. While holding Alt, select both the horizontal and vertical stretch, and then we can select a sprite to use as the frame. So we'll just take it from the UI sprite sheet that we have. And once we have this frame, we can set the pixels per unit multiplier to something higher like 1.5 so that the frame isn't so thick. And there we go. Next up, we'll be creating the scroll view that will hold our character icons. Right-click on the character select background in the hierarchy, go over to UI, and down here you should see a scroll view. Click it to create a scroll view as a child of the character select background. After this, go over to the scroll view scroll rec component and untick the horizontal checkbox as we do not need the scroll view to scroll horizontally. You can also delete the scroll view scroll bar horizontal game object as well. After that, go back to the scroll view and go to the scroll view's rec transform. Open up the Anchor Presets menu, and while holding Alt, stretch it both horizontally and vertically. Next, you want to set the left, right, top, and bottom values to these. We've left a space at the bottom because we will be adding in a description box later. Finally, you can disable the scroll view's image component to remove the gray background. After we're done modifying the scroll view, we can configure its content game object. The content of a scroll view is basically where the game objects that will scroll are placed in. In the hierarchy, it can be found underneath the scroll view's viewport. Open up the content and we'll be modifying its rect transform. Next, in the content's anchor preset window, we'll hold Alt and make the content stretch both horizontally and vertically. After that, we'll add a new grid layout group component, and we'll set the cell size of both X and Y to 130. Next, set the spacing for both X and Y to 15. And finally, for the constraint, we'll set it to fixed column count and make the constraint count 4. This ensures that the character icons that we will lay out here later will be spaced out evenly in 4 columns. The next component that we'll be adding in is a content size fitter. We'll set the vertical fit to preferred size. What the content size fitter does is it will automatically resize the content area if the game objects in the content start to overflow. This will also enable the player to scroll down when needed as well. Our last component that we will add is a toggle group. We'll be using this later when we start creating our icons. Before we move on from the character select scroll view, we'll need to add in one more piece of UI, which is the character icon template. This template will be used in a script later to generate standardized character icons of every character in your game. Therefore, it's important to note that the script will make use of the template game object names, so you'll need to name them exactly as how they're being named in this video. For example, if I name a game object weapon icon with a capital W and I and a space in the middle, you'll need to type it exactly as how it's been typed. To start, right-click the content game object and create a new UI image game object as its child. We will rename this image to template. As you can see here, you're unable to modify the image's position or sizing as they are influenced by the content's grid layout group over here. If you'd want to change the template size or positioning, you'll need to change the cell size and spacing over here, although you'd also probably need to resize the other UI as well. Heading back into the template, we'll be able to change its background, and we'll also add a new toggle component that will be used later. Finally, we can give this template a frame for decoration. Next up, we'll be adding in the game objects that will be linked to different parts of the character icon, such as the character's name, the icon itself, and the weapon icon. Now the first game object that we'll be creating will be a text mesh pro that will hold the character's name. Right-click the template game object, go over to UI, and select text mesh pro. Remember to type out the game object's name exactly as how I typed it. It will be character name with a capital C and N and a space over here. Other than the naming, you're free to configure the UI how you'd like. I'll just anchor the character name to the top left corner of the template and change the values accordingly. The next game object that we'll be creating for the template will be the character icon. Right-click on the template, go over to UI and select Image. We'll name the game object as so. I'll just anchor the character icon to the bottom left of the template and I'll configure it accordingly. The final game object that we'll add will be the weapon icon. Let's right-click the template, go over to UI and select Image. We'll be naming this game object as so. I'll just put my weapon icon anchored to the bottom right of the template and I'll configure it accordingly. Once you're done setting up the template game objects, you'll want to check whether your character's names fit into the name box like so, as well as check whether the icons display your sprites properly. For example, if we select the character icon as our OG player character over here, you can see that he's pretty stretched. To fix this, we can go back to the image component of the character icon and check preserve aspect. Once we've configured our icon template, we can move on to the final UI, which is the description box. Firstly, we'll create an image under Character Select background. We'll call this description box. And we'll set the anchors like so. Finally, we'll set the left, top, right, and bottom values to 0 so that the description box is at the bottom of our Character Select scroll view. After anchoring it, you can change its color. And once again, we'll be giving it a frame. Next, we'll be adding in 4 more game objects as children of the description box. Unlike the template game objects, you can name these game objects any way you'd like since we'll be manually assigning them to the script. Firstly, we'll add a text Pro game object for the character's full name. Secondly, we'll be adding in another text Pro game object to serve as the character's description. Thirdly, we'll be adding an image game object to display the character's icon. Finally, we'll be adding in another image for the weapon icon. You can choose to frame this image if you'd like. Once you're done, remember to test out how the description box looks by adding in placeholder text and images. Before we move on, let's navigate to our character data script in the player scripts folder and open it up in Visual Studio. We'll be adding a few variables to it that we will use to assign a full name and a description to a character. Now that our character data is set up, we'll need to make sure that the variables of our character data scriptable objects are set up properly so that the character select screen displays them correctly. Currently, the character select screen uses 6 of these variables, which are the icon, the name, the full name, the character description, the starting weapon, and the stats. You can check out the Vampire Survivors wiki for the info about the original characters, and if you need character sprites used as icons, we'll be linking a sprite sheet you can use in the description below. After setting up your characters, we can start creating the scripts that will get our character select screen working. The first script that we'll be looking at is the character selector under the scripts folder. Firstly, we'll open it up in Visual Studio and rename it. To do so, highlight the class name, right-click, and select Rename. We will rename it to UICharacterSelector, and then click Apply. After this, we can make the changes that we need to the script. Let's briefly go through the new variables and functions that we've added into the script. The static variable selected stores the selected character's character data. It's made static so it can persist across different scenes and be assigned to the player in the game scene. The stats UI variable simply stores the UIStatDisplay that will be updated with the selected character's stats. The variables under the template header are used to assign the icon template and identify the paths, which are the game object names in the template that the script will update. The paths are already preset with strings, which is why it was important for us to name the template game objects exactly. Finally, the variables under the description box header will be updated with the selected character's info. Now, let's head over into the functions. The start function basically selects a default character to load in if it's been assigned. This is to ensure that the UI displays are already filled with character information once the player enters the scene. The next function, getAllCharacterData.assets, is a function only meant to be called in the editor. It's used to fetch and store all character data assets in the project in a list based on their file extension .asset. getData is a static function that will be called in the PlayerStats script to assign the selected character to the player in the game scene. If you enter the game scene without choosing a character such as through the editor, it will randomly select one for us instead. Finally, the select function will be called when a character icon is clicked. It assigns the currently selected character, updates the stats display with their stats, and updates the description box. After modifying the script, we'll need to navigate to our PlayerStats script underneath the Player Scripts folder and change a few lines. This is because it relies on the UICharacterSelector script that we just modified. In the awake function, we've just renamed the character selector class to its new name, as well as removed any lines that destroy the character selector's game object, as we do not need to carry the game object over, unlike our last character selector. After this, we can return back to our Unity project, select the old character selector, and delete it. Then, we can go over to the character select background and attach the UICharacterSelector as a component. Now, we need to fill in the required variables. Alright, so let's drag in a character data over here to use as our default character. Let's drag in the UIStatDisplay to use as our stats UI. And let's go over here to the scroll views content and drag the template into the toggle template. Now you want to make sure that the toggle template's game object names match the paths over here. So character name matches the character name path, the weapon icon matches the weapon icon path, and the character icon matches the character icon path. Finally, you want to drag in the description box variables, which are the character full name, the character description, the character icon, and the character weapon icon. Once we've set the variables, let's head over to the UI editor scripts folder over here, and let's create one last script. This will be an editor script called UICharacterSelectorEditor. And then we'll open it up. So to briefly explain what the UICharacterSelectorEditor script does is that it's an editor script made for our UICharacterSelector. Editor scripts allow you to customize the Unity editor, and this particular script adds a button to the UICharacterSelector component using the onInspectorGUI function over here. Clicking this button triggers this function, create toggles for character data, and running through this function step by step, it first checks whether we assign a toggle template since it needs the template to create the icons. If not, it gives us a warning. Next, it reads everything in the scroll views content window except for our template game object, and then after that, it gets a list of all the character data assets in our project using the UICharacterSelector's getAllCharacterData.cs function. Once that's done, it creates a new character icon for each character. Over here, it assigns the different character data variables such as the character's name to the template game objects using their paths. Finally, it adds a select function down here to the toggle component on our toggle that is triggered when the player clicks on the character icon. This means that after you've set up and assigned your toggle template, you can simply focus on just creating your characters, and once you're done, you can click the button in the UICharacterSelector to generate their icons automatically. No manual icon creation needed. Let's head back into our Unity project and see the scripts in action. All of our variables are set properly over here in the UICharacterSelector, so you can press the Generate Selectable Characters button and there we go! A character icon is created for each character in your project. This saves us a lot of time since we don't need to create a new icon ourselves every time we add a character. Now all that's left to do is go into play mode and test everything out. Alright, so the default character is set to Gennaro, which is good. It's showing his stats. Does it show Llama's stats? Yep. Antonio, Poe, Porta, and their weapons and icons are all being displayed properly. There's description is being displayed properly as well. And let's select Porta to play as. I think this is the lightning ring, so when we go into the game there should be a lot of lightning, and it should be really fast since the cooldown is negative 90%. And yep, looks like everything works. Great. And just to add a bit more flair, you could also add a new background image for the whole scene, or you could also just go into the camera over here and set the background to any color you'd like. And with that, we've successfully revamped our character select scene and made the character creation process much more easier with the editor scripts. Thanks for watching!